There it is, and we are live. Yay, we're
Yay.
live.
I'm
Welcome,
trying to
everybody.
find, yeah, welcome. I'm trying to find us on Facebook. Are we are live? We're going?
Yep, we are.
Okay. All right. So,
It said that it
welcome.
was a peer group, so we'll see. Anyway,
Well, welcome everyone to our next conversation about gender equality at work, pursuing gender equality at work. It's our Facebook group. It's also a group on LinkedIn. And I'm Barbara Zabawa and Michaela Conley. Wave, hi. I call her my partner in crime on this show. Today we have a guest speaker, Rachael Robnett, who is a psychologist and professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and has done some research. I've read a little bit about it on different gender issues, but today, and she might talk about those other issues, but today I wanted to talk to her primarily about adoption of surnames. By women and or men, because I know that was a recent research topic that you looked into. But I'll have her introduce herself, give us a little bit more about her background and interests, and then dive right into her research. So welcome, Rachael.
can I just interrupt for a split second and say if you have questions and you're live with us, raise your hand. If you're on Facebook, you know we're watching. So, which is a little bit creepy now that I say it out loud, but we are here. So, welcome.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm a psychologist. I work at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I study all things gender. And so that does mean that I study a lot of gender-related dynamics pertaining to surnames, romantic relationships. Also of interest, potentially, I study women's experiences in male dominated or historically male dominated fields. So a lot of that research focuses on the science and technology career pathways. But with regard to my romantic relationship research, the catalyst for this was actually a research study that I did back as a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz. And so this was back in 2010, and I sampled the students at UC Santa Cruz and asked them about things like marriage proposals and surname preferences, and was really astounded at this supposedly very progressive institution. The vast majority of the undergraduate student body expressed a preference for tradition in their heterosexual romantic relationships. And so what this looked like was that a lot of the women, a lot of the men, they wanted traditional surnames in their own relationships when they were looking to the future. When I asked, do you want the woman to adopt the man's surname in your relationship? Is that something that would be meaningful to you? Vast majority said, yes, I want to stick with tradition. That's the way that it has always been done. And I thought that that was striking because usually the students at Santa Cruz like to push the envelope a little bit in terms of traditions, but they were really embracing these traditions related to heterosexual romantic relationships. So I said, okay, we've got to follow up. And so subsequently, I did 2 studies that looked at stereotypes that people have of women when they choose to adopt when they choose to keep their own surname after getting married. So basically, the question in this line of research is, do people view women differently depending on whether or not they keep their adopting their partner's surname? And the take-home message from that research is that people, in fact, hold stereotypes about women depending on what surname option they choose. And moreover, they hold stereotypes about the woman's husband. So if I'm a woman and I keep my own surname after getting married, so if I do the non-traditional thing, people have certain beliefs about my commitment to my marriage, about my personality traits, but also making inferences about my husband and about the power dynamics in the relationship, which is really fascinating to me that we're able to get these effects in a day and age where like so many other genderal traditions seem to be falling by the wayside. And yet in this context of romantic relationships, it seems like people are still really holding on to tradition and in fact making inferences about people who violate those traditions.
Who's making those inferences? Is it both genders, men and women, are
That's
looking at the power dynamics like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, both women and men do this. But of course, it depends on your own level of traditionality, right? So if you have somebody who is incredibly progressive, who likes to go against the grain, you're probably not going to hold those stereotypes to the same degree as a person who's much more traditional, who likes those traditional values. So there is certainly variation, but not along gender lines, not the way that you would think. Both women and men do show a tendency toward these stereotypes.
Hmm. Interesting. So, I've been having conversations lately with different members of the group pursuing gender equality in the workplace, and women who did change their name because of marriage and then later, get divorced, or, are out of the relationship, um, and the impact that has on their careers, especially while they were married with their married name, have built a career with that name. And now all of a sudden, like mid-career, they are no longer in that relationship for whatever reason. And now, they do, what do they do? They'd like to go back to their maiden name, but everyone knows them, their network knows them as this other last name, and how challenging that really is for women who change their names. Do you have
Yeah.
any, like, did your research kind of look into that at all, that aspect?
Yeah, so one of the things I do in my studies is I actually ask both women and men to give me some insight into the reasoning underlying their preferences. So, for example, there are women in my studies who say, I'm not really sure about this whole name change thing. I'm a little bit ambivalent. And one of their major reasons for ambivalence is the professional ramifications. So, for example, if I'm a woman and I have published a lot under my current surname, and then I get married, like you said, there's the question of whether I change my name and then have to rebuild that name recognition, or whether I, keep my name, keep that professional reputation, but then maybe encounter some of these stereotypes about women who do non-traditional things. So 100%, I can say that this weighs on at least some of the women in my studies. And interestingly, some of the women also say that this is incredibly unfair, that if they adopt their partner's surname and then go through a divorce, everybody potentially in the professional sphere is going to know about this depending on what they do with their last name. And that doesn't really seem like, that seems like a source of inequity, right?
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah,
Yeah.
because then no one might know that, they're
Exactly.
having relationship changes, because their name is constant. And
Right.
the woman, yeah, I mean, if she changes, like, what's going on? Wow, that's really interesting. And I also, I don't know if your research has led you down the path on, I mean, we talked about it just kind of on the surface, the frustration of women having to decide about name changes. Uh, is it just perception, or is it real as far as the impact on a career and a profession? Have you looked at that angle at all? Like, is there real
That's
impact?
So that's great. That's a great question. And in terms of real impact in the workplace, I haven't seen the data. I haven't done that research myself, but there was a study. It's a little bit outdated at this point, but it looked at whether women in the workplace were using the term Mrs. versus Ms. versus Miss. So another source of inequity, right? And they found, actually, this was interesting, that the women who used Ms. MS were actually viewed more seriously, like taken more seriously from a professional standpoint, whereas the women who used the other two options were viewed as like not really prioritizing their career. So I do think that people are making inferences based on surname related decisions. As far as recent research out there looking at the real world professional context, I haven't seen it. I suspect that there would be findings though.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to see what those repercussions are on, you know, the decision to adopt a different surname on, you know, upon marriage. And have you looked at why? Do you know the history? I mean, I'm gonna guess it's like gender related and all that, but do you have the history of why we have this tradition of women adopting their husband's surname? I could guess, but I'm curious to know what the real history is on that.
Yeah, so in terms of the long-term history, I'm not entirely sure, but the shorter term history, actually, there's been a lot of great work from the field of law that's been written. And basically, this practice originates from a time when women were perceived as their husband's property. And so the idea was that you are going to take the husband's surname to indicate that you are now his,
Mm-hmm.
which is like kind of disturbing roots for the tradition. And obviously, the vast majority of people today who are adhering to the tradition, who decide to change their surname, they aren't thinking about it in terms of property,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yeah, those are the roots of the tradition, and that does give some people pause when they're thinking about this practice.
What do they think about? Because I saw that you had done some research with like um, teens, you know,
Yeah,
and traditions like who
yeah,
proposes marriage and what, why are women still, I mean, we don't think about the historical context of the property issue. I mean, I didn't, maybe
yeah,
I didn't. I mean, when I got married the first time, I hyphenated my last name,
yeah,
which, you know, 30 years ago was unusual to say the least. And I have to just add, it bothered me to no end. I had a hyphenated last name. That was what was on my social security card and my driver's license. And yet, whenever I received mail from like family, they would always put Mr. and Mrs. and then my husband's name,
oh
or
yeah,
Mrs. Barbara and then my husband's last name, even though my last name was hyphenated.
yeah.
Anyway, so what is the calculus when you know, women or men are deciding on changing their name? Is it children, future
Yeah.
children, not burdening them with a hyphenated last name, which is what I've done with my kids, um, who by the way are really kind of annoyed with it, to be all honest. Uh,
Yeah.
so what is it?
Yeah, it's a couple of things. So when you ask people, and this has been demonstrated across a lot of studies, when you ask people, why do you want to do this traditional thing? Some of them just say it's tradition, that's the way it's always been done, period. But I think a lot of other people are thinking about it in terms of family unity. Like you said, it's nice for everybody in the family to be united under the same surname. And there are certainly women who view it as a sign of spousal devotion.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like, this is me demonstrating that I am committed to this other person. So it's kind of a combination, I think, of wanting to go with what's always been done, but also wrapping it up with these commonplace notions of what it means to be a devoted partner. And then I also think that we do have all of these stereotypes about people who push against the tradition. And so I think that that's also weighing on what people's reasoning is. Like, if I think that my husband is going to be negatively stereotyped because of my surname decision, that's probably going to weigh on what I end up doing in some regard.
Hmm. Yeah, well, let's talk about those stereotypes of men. So what men who either adopt their wife's last name, or I don't know a better word. I've been trying to describe this, talk to other people over
Yeah.
the week, and like men who allow, I don't know if that's not the right word, but it's getting me there. Their wife to keep her name.
Yeah.
The wife decides to keep her name, which reminds, I just have to say, I love the movie When Harry Met Sally. Do you guys know that movie?
It's a
Yeah.
great movie.
There's a scene where um, uh, Billy Crystal's character is, I think, talking to Meg Ryan. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he's about to get married to his first wife, and he says, "Yeah, her name's Helen. She's keeping her name." Um, And, you know, that was supposed to, it actually kind of, you know, gives the perception of, you know, there is some, she's very dominant.
Right.
His soon to be wife, Helen, seems to be very dominant, and he's okay with that.
Yeah.
Is that continued? The perception is.
Yeah. I mean, so that's exactly what I'm capturing with some of my studies. So I can start by talking about the stereotypes about women, and I want to say some of these stereotypes, I don't actually make a judgment about whether they are good or bad in valence. They're just out there. But so the first stereotype, which is kind of negative in connotation, is that if a woman keeps her own surname, she's less committed to her marriage. I don't think that anybody wants to be perceived in that regard. Um, with regard to personality stereotypes, which could actually bear on how women are perceived in the workplace, women who keep their own last name are perceived as more agentic, dominant, pushy, which is, again, those terms have kind of negative connotations, but it's also the case that in the modern workplace, some of those agentic traits are actually associated with success. So that's what's going on with the women. With the men, so if the man allows his wife to keep her own surname, which is, I mean, it is sort of a discussion in a lot of couples, right? Like it is a bit of a negotiation, and some women say that they are acquiescing to their partner. Like when their partner is helping them navigate this decision, they kind of acquiesce. So it is a negotiation process. In any event, when the husband's wife decides to keep her own surname, he is perceived as holding less power than her in the relationship, and he's perceived as a little bit more stereotypically feminine. And again, that has a negative connotation for a lot of people, but it's not all bad. He's viewed as kind-hearted, as kind of soft, as very accommodating. So it depends on who you are, but those traits aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So have you looked at the trend at all of surname adoption? Is it pretty stagnant over the years, or are we seeing an increase in women keeping their last names, or what do the trends look like?
Yeah, so there's been some really great research looking at US Census data, and the trends are going to differ a little bit depending on your level of education, how old you are when you get married, and things like your ethnic or religious background. So that's a big caveat, all varies. But historically, if we aggregate across all people, there was kind of an increase in women keeping their own last name up through about the mid 1980s. Then it kind of plateaued, and now it seems like it's going out of vogue a little bit. Like there's been a little resurgence of the traditional preferences.
Really?
Yeah. So it's definitely not been like this linear trajectory where we're becoming more and more willing to go against tradition. It looks like it peaked in the 80s or 90s, and now we're kind of going back the other direction.
That's interesting, because I would have thought that in the world of social media, you maybe buy your domain name, your name as a domain name, and you have this Twitter handle, and you have all that stuff, and maybe that's an age thing more so. But I would think, sort of in the terms of, and I hate the idea of personal branding, makes me want to bleh. But along those lines, I would have expected that you would want to keep the name you have for that continuity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a great idea for a research study, in that you could ask people who are very active within the social media genre, so influencers or micro influencers, right? The people who have built this brand around their name.
Yeah.
It would be very interesting to take a look at their preferences. And I do think that you get little hints of that in specific professions, right? So like in academia, for example, and I imagine also in law, you build your reputation around your name. And so this decision of whether to change it is a bit weightier. I also, this is anecdotal, but at a couple of my talks, I've had people in real estate, women in real estate, tell me that it's actually very important for them to not change their name, because it's this whole marketing campaign, and they build up name recognition and don't necessarily want to throw that out the window. So, I mean, I think that you're going to get pockets where it's actually more common for women to keep their own last name after marriage. As far as the broader social sphere, I don't see a lot of dramatic change.
Interesting. Well, if you do that research study, please let us know.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, we'll do a follow-up.
I mean, do you think people generally know the history? Like we talked about the short-term history of the property issue. Do you think people generally know that history and are just, don't care, or they don't know, and if they did know, would care, would change, would that impact their thoughts about the name adoption?
Yeah, I think that there are certainly some people who know, and that's one of their key rationales for doing the non-traditional thing. So there are some people out there who know and who are disturbed by it. I also think that there's a general sentiment that that was in the past. That's not the way it is today. Women have legal rights. They have the right to vote. Like, we've progressed beyond that. And so there's an idea that it's safe to adhere to tradition because women have come so far.
Yes, but then if you put that against the other statement you had, where women who do keep their own name,
right,
at least in the workplace, are viewed as, well, some negative connotations, but also those same descriptors are translate to more success.
yeah.
If that knowledge was out there, more prevalent, would that, do you think that would affect the trend line?
That could be interesting. That could be really interesting. Basically, the idea is that you would tell people, be really transparent. Here's what the research says about surname adoption. Does this change how you reason about it? And I imagine for some people, it would give them pause. The tricky thing that I've found with many of these heterosexual romantic relationship traditions is that they're so ingrained and they're wrapped up with these ideas of romance that people are a little bit reluctant to question them, because why would you question something as nice as spousal devotion or family unity?
Yeah.
So I think that you would probably have a group of people who, if you presented them with all of the data, they'd say, okay, I'm going to think about this differently. Others probably would be kind of dismissive and say, this is the way I want to do it. It's tradition. It's fine. It's nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess. I mean, I guess it depends on how important it is that, they have independence with how driven they are, maybe how important their career is, and how versus their romantic relationships, because I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can have a romantic relationship with your partner and still try to be as successful as you can be in the workplace. I think you can do both.
Yeah, they should not be at odds.
Yeah. And I wonder if it's, who's out there putting out these messages. I mean, that, like we're talking about. Think about the surname adoption in terms of your career. If that's important to you, look at the data. Is there anyone other than, you guys putting out the scholarly articles for the academic world to read? I mean, is Oprah on board with that?
No, let's get her on board. That would be great if you have that connection. I mean, I think it's probably these messages, at least in my field, are sort of getting translated within mentoring relationships. And I'm not sure I'm curious about whether that's the case for you too. But when my graduate students come up through the pipeline, we talk about these things. We talk about the perceptions, and we weigh the decisions, and we weigh the potential professional ramifications. And so I know with me, with my students, and I think more generally in my field, those conversations do sometimes happen. I'm not sure if that's been the case for you or if it's not something that's on the radar. I don't know how widespread that is.
You mean me as a professional, as a
Yeah.
not at all.
No,
And
not so much.
not at all. I mean, when I back in 1993, when I got married the first time and I did the hyphenated last name, I was very young. I don't really. It wasn't the maybe it was the property thing. I don't know why. I mean, I just felt like I was very driven and I had a vision and I had big dreams and I wanted to maintain my own identity. And at the time, hyphenating my last name, even though it was a very cumbersome, not very friendly last name when you put it all together, that was the compromise I made to myself and to my then husband. If I could redo it, I would never have done hyphenated. I would just kept my last name, and which is what my second marriage is what I've done. And so, but if I had known like the data, which I don't know if back then it was even available, but it would have definitely impacted me. But I mean, as far as like, do we talk about it in the profession, like in women's groups? No, that's why I started this group for gender equality work, because we weren't talking about these very habitual, traditional social norms that most women I know just kind of blindly accept.
Right.
This is what we do.
Right.
What we're expected to do. And we work within those boundaries. And the purpose of this group is to really question, are those boundaries really good for us? I mean, are we doing ourselves a disservice by accepting these boundaries? Why are we accepting these boundaries? I want to know why. And the first thing that, came to mind for me in starting the group in my new company is purses. Why do we carry purses?
Yeah.
Why do we carry purses? Because our clothes don't have pockets. Why don't our clothes have pockets? Another gender discrimination issue, because we weren't supposed to be working and earning money or having a need for pockets.
Exactly.
We weren't supposed to be venturing out of the home and carrying things anyway. And if we were with our husband, who would carry what we needed to be carried. That's why. You mean another whole show on that, but but yeah. So that the last name, the clothing that we wear, there's so many norms in the workplace that we just have learned to accept that. At the same time, while we're trying to pursue gender equality in the workplace, that seems to work against one another. And so even though they seem small, they add up, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. I think they add up. So anyway,
I think
answer to your question.
But what you said resonates in the sense that these small things do add up. They take a cumulative toll. Mm-hmm. And further, that's one of the most striking things across my time doing this research is that we really don't question these gender-related traditions. We don't. So many people align with them without really thinking about what they're doing or envisioning other ways of being. And I think, sometimes if you adhere to tradition, maybe that's totally fine. Maybe that works for you, but I think for a lot of people, it actually does them a disservice. And yet we aren't even questioning it. We aren't thinking about how we can do this differently or how we can structure things differently to be a little bit more equitable. Mm-hmm. So I mean, what you said absolutely aligns with my experience and what I've noticed just in giving talks and in doing this line of research.
Well, that's reaffirming. Thanks.
No, right. Like it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and I just think it's really important for us, for this group, to just take a pause and say, okay, why are we putting ourselves through some of these things that I don't think, if we really thought about it, we would do. Exactly. If there were other options available, if
you're right. We do so many things just like as lemmings. It's about that moment of going, yes, I do have a choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Providing those choices, providing the knowledge of what those choices might be, and then creating the choices as well. if they're not already in existence. I just think that's really important. So you've done a little bit of work too around race and gender. Can you speak a little bit to what things you've looked at on that front, since so much front of mind stuff right now is on racial inequality.
Yeah. And so do you mean more broadly in the workplace or with regard to romantic relationships specifically?
Oh, probably in the workplace. Let's do
Yeah.
workplace.
Yeah, so I mean, my research focusing on the workplace looks at a lot of the little inequities that accrue to end up taking a toll on somebody's professional trajectory. And so kind of to give you the landscape of the field there, and I think like common public sentiment, there's the idea right now that in the workplace, gender no longer matters, everybody's equal, race no longer matters, everybody's equal. And so to give like a really concrete example, I was recently talking with some people who are working at a law firm, and they said, what are you talking about? Gender bias, sexism? That doesn't happen in law. Like a lot of women are in law school. Our firm is 50% women. And so a lot of people are pointing to the numbers and saying, yeah, we're 50-50, we're good. Like we're fine, we don't have an issue. And so I agree that that's a really good indication of progress, but you also have to look at some of those subtle dynamics that are occurring within the workplace to get a sense of whether it's really an equitable environment for those 50% of women who happen to be working there, or those 50% of people of color who happen to be working there. And so what my research looks into are like subtle forms of gender bias or sexism, like being excluded from drinks after work, or overhearing a comment that's somewhat negative about a member of your group. It turns out that hearing those has a cumulative impact. If you hear one offhand comment, it may or may not really influence you. But the problem is that these are often occurring with some frequency within the workplace. And so any one instance, it's hard to call it out and say, this is a problem. We have a bad culture in the workplace. Mm-hmm. But when the small things are happening over a long period of time, it legitimately erodes people's sense of belonging. It erodes their commitments to the workplace, and it makes them less committed to the job that they're doing. Yeah. In a lot of instances, they're feeling like this is not a place where I am welcome. And it's really, really hard to deeply engage in your work when you don't feel like you're welcome, because you have part of your cognitive space devoted to processing what's going on in the context. And then the rest of your mental space is dedicated to doing your job. But that's still like divided mental space. That's still going to be hard to do as good a job as possible when part of you is constantly processing what's going on in the environment. What are these slights meaning? Is this a place where I can actually continue in the long term?
Do you have that in writing somewhere? That is just beautiful. I love that, because it really just eloquently explains how these little things, the sense of belonging, erode the sense of belonging, and how that translates into, your productivity and your well-being, essentially, at work. And I would love to be able to have that in writing. Is that like from a study you've done, or
an accumulation? Like it's a big body of research, and I can definitely send some papers related to this, but I can also give like that what I described was kind of theoretical. I can also give a concrete anecdote from one of my colleagues. And she said, when I first started out in academia, the first day that I went in to teach, this is a woman of color. The first day I went in to teach my class, the professor who was there before me assumed that I was a student and told me that, I shouldn't be messing around with the computer in the front of the classroom and that I should go take my seats. Wow. And she said, and I mean, she said it happened to her the one time and she thought it was kind of weird, and she dismissed it as just an idiosyncratic interaction. And she went on with her lecture and it was fine. And then over the course of her first semester teaching, this happened in various iterations multiple times, where people would assume that she is a student because she's a younger woman of color. They assume that she cannot be in this authority position as a professor. Sometimes they would assume if she was in a research lab that she was the janitorial staff. So she would know like shocking things. And so she said when it happened the first time and the second time, you know, I can chalk it up to that person being kind of idiosyncratic. When it happened systematically, those experiences accrued to make her feel like she didn't belong. And then every time she would go up to lecture or every time she would go in to run her research lab, there was this little grain of doubt where she was wondering, do people think I belong here? Will people accept me? Do they think I'm competent? And that's a tough thing to have in the back of your mind. And I think that actually happens to a lot of people who are in professions where they aren't necessarily expected to be there or where they don't match the typical demographic background.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So what ultimately happens? Did she I mean, did she leave? Is she still there? What's?
Yeah. So she is still there and she did a couple of things. I mean, she was able to find other women of color who had experienced similar things and understanding that it wasn't just about her, but that this was more like a systemic problem. Like on the one hand, that's depressing because it's hard to fix a systemic problem. But she also knew that she had these colleagues who were kind of experiencing similar things and they could relate to one another and talk about it and develop coping strategies. And so, I mean, I think at this point, that was a couple of years ago, I think at this point, she's prepared herself that those things are sometimes going to happen and she can process them and cope with them better than she could initially. But I mean, it's definitely a process. And I don't think that there's, you know, any point in time where you can say, all right, I'm fine. I'm over it. It doesn't bother me anymore.
But this group that she found was instrumental in helping her find
Yes.
coping.
Yes. Yeah, and that's actually something that I get. This is relevant to our discussion here, right? This is something that I get from lots of women, like in tech fields, in math intensive fields. They say, you know, the reason that I'm able to persist is because I found a group of other people where we can talk about these things and bring them to light. Like that's critical. That's uniform across my data.
Interesting. So yeah, because I've often struggled with, you know, the purpose of this group. You know, a lot of times people create groups or organizations to make change, and you know, ultimately I'd love to see change too, but it's helpful to hear that there's value in just voicing observations
Yes.
and sharing observations.
Yes, there's huge value. I mean, there are theories of organizational change that say the first step is raising the voices and recognizing that what I experienced is not unique. I mean, you have to have that in place before change can happen.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Is that in writing too somewhere?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I'll maintain a list of things to send. Definitely.
All very validating.
Yeah.
Michael, do you have any questions for Rachel?
As I was listening, I was thinking what you're talking about, sort of those subtle things. I sort of think about it in terms of, could be in a relationship, could be anywhere, sort of, you know, the difference between mental abuse and physical abuse. You know, if somebody punches you in the jaw, you've got a bruise and you know for sure it happened. But when somebody mentally abuses you, they say, you know, those little comments, you're kind of left feeling like, is that me? You know, all that crazy stuff that it brings up. So I think, you know, the idea of a group where you can say those things out loud and realize, yeah, it's not me, and it's a shared experience.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I mean that, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, what you said is so important. Like that period of time where you're questioning, like, was that an insult to me? Was that about my group memberships? That takes such a toll because if you think about cognition as a finite resource, which it is, right? Like you can only dedicate so much of your brain to a given task. So if you think of cognition as a finite resource, and if you have this much of it consumed by wondering, what did that mean? Was that about me? Does everybody doubt my competence? Then you have less cognition available to focus on the task at hand or to focus on your job or to focus on whatever other thing you need to be focusing on. So it might seem minor, but actually, when you're devoting your cognitive resources elsewhere and someone else does not have to do the same thing, that's a disadvantage. That's an inequity.
Yeah.
Um, Getting back to the whole surname thing, just follow up with for the men who
Oh yeah, I wanted to
buy,
ask.
keep their last name. Has anyone looked at like the impact on the careers of men? I mean, they may be perceived as, uh, I know you'd used a different word, but weak.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But is that detrimental to their career trajectory in the same way that women who keep their last names maybe have more statistically more success?
Yeah, so the data aren't out there, which is my caveat, and the reason is actually because people who are pushing against these traditions, they're still relatively uncommon, and so it's hard to get a good sample of people who have actually done the non-traditional thing and examine what's going on. You could get at it in some other ways, but my suspicion, my hypothesis is that probably if men are in fact being viewed in these more stereotypically feminine ways, in a lot of professions, that's not going to be great professionally, but it depends on what you're doing and it depends on how progressive your workplace is, right? So I don't want to say anything too strongly because the data aren't out there, but we know that these traits of agency, dominance, these tend to be good things in a lot of workplaces. We know that these traits associated with being more communal or expressive, like being more soft-hearted or being more accommodating, in a lot of workplaces, these aren't associated with success. So it's probably going to vary like everything. But if we did this study, I do think that you might see some negative career implications if we just look at the average.
What about kids? So women who keep their last names in a marriage, and then there's children who become part of that family. Are we seeing, what I suspect is that even though the wife keeps her name, that when children are born, they adopt the father's last name? Is that really?
It's incredibly common, incredibly common. There are only a few instances I know of where the kids end up taking the wife's last name and the husband has a different surname. And those are like so uncommon that they're written up as case studies in the literature. So there's not like actually a good sample of people. There's like a case study about the one time this happened.
Interesting.
Yeah.
My kids might be a case study.
Yeah.
They have a hyphenated last name, but as they approach age 18, which is just a few years away now, they've talked about changing their last name to just be one of the two. And I'm not trying to influence them too much, but I think because my last name's first, they might just drop the second part. I don't know. I mean, they're talking about though, because it is a cumbersome last name when you have the two together. I mean, there's no doubt it's very long and hard to say, and yeah. So,
what about men who take their wives' last name? Is that also kind of case study material? I have never known a man to do that, but I could see there might be some reasons, like if maybe you were a Kennedy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So there's definitely not, to my knowledge, there's not a lot of research on that. Maybe some case studies, but I mean, I think that it's uncommon enough that when it happens, I've seen popular press articles coming out in like the Huffington Post or wherever, where they actually talk about this guy who took his wife's surname. So I think that it's a very uncommon social phenomenon.
That is, I don't know anybody who took a man who's taken his wife's surname. Do we have any questions from any of the listeners? I mean, do we have any listeners? Jennifer's on.
And I actually haven't looked over at Facebook for a bit, but along with the outliers, I have to ask, what about gay and lesbian relationships? I never thought about whose name. How do you do that? I mean, what's the norm?
Yeah, what is the norm?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that because one of my graduate students just finished a paper on it, so I can speak to that issue. And so this is my student Carrie, and what Carrie found is that it depends a little bit on how old you are, because there is a major shift in how gay and lesbian people reason about this, depending on whether they are coming of age in this time of marriage equality versus whether they came of age more so before marriage equality was on the table. So basically, what we're seeing is that people who were getting married or thinking about getting married or wanting to get married, say like 15, 20 years ago, they are actually kind of resistant to sharing a surname with their partner. They feel like that is a heteronormative tradition. They've been excluded from marriage rights and they don't want any part of it. So they're basically saying, you know what? We've been excluded. We don't want to do this traditional thing that those heterosexual people do. Leave us out, we'll do our own thing. And so one of the cool creative solutions that they are employing is either hyphenation or creating a completely new name. So that could be like a blend. Like I talked to some people at a conference recently, and they are, let's see, one of the women in the relationship was a Ray before she got married, and the other person was a Shaw, and they blended their names to Brad Shea, and that's their last name.
That's so cool. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah. So they blended their names together. They came up with this creative solution. They were happy to do something that wasn't whole heteronormative tradition. On the other hand, if I ask who are more undergraduate age about this, so if I ask people in gay and lesbian relationships, hey, looking ahead to when you get married to your partner, what do you want to do? They're kind of on board with the surname tradition. Like they are saying, you know what, I would really love to adopt my wife's last name. Like it's really cool, we're included in this tradition now. And so we want to do these traditional things to show that we're, doing it in the way that it's been done in the past. So in other words, they're sort of taking advantage of this access to marriage equality, and they're saying, yeah, like let's do it, this is cool. So I'm seeing I'm seeing kind of an age division, and I'm also seeing some really cool creative solutions among those who are kind of resistant to what we see in heterosexual relationships.
That's all. I had no idea you could choose, our name's going to be,
Yeah. See, that's the thing, is we don't talk about all the creative solutions out there. People in heterosexual relationships could do that too, right? There are a lot of things on the table.
Right.
Not that creative.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that would solve some of the issues around the children too, because then you're not burdening them with multiple, last names.
Totally. Doesn't solve the professional issue though. So that's
not.
No. Yeah,
and that is a huge issue. I mean, I just can't tell you how many people. I mean, Jennifer, I know she's on. I don't know if she had a question, but she had a similar concern about changing her last name, even though she'd like to. It's not her last name. It's her ex-husband's last name. And so I don't know, Jennifer, if you're listening, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask yourself.
Oh, yeah. Hello. I'm really enjoying the conversation. Hi, Rachel. Yeah. So obviously, years ago I got married, and I did not change my name at that time. Because it was a hard name to spell. Abernathy, it has a different spelling. I was in sales, so I found myself always having to spell it on the phone. And I thought, you know what? I'm not going to change my name. And then years later, I got a book deal. And I was, quote unquote, told by branding people that I should really change it over to that name because it starts with an A. And I'll be listed on the top of every speaking place that I spoke at. I would be the first person on the list, and it's true. And I have to say, I did like it for that. It was very helpful. I was always the first one. I was always at the top of the marquee. I mean, it was just, it was good. They were right. But then years later, I got divorced. And my kids are out of school now. And so there's really no need for me to keep the name. But I have 2 books under that name, with major publishers. And I'm like, what do I do? And so I've just kept the name for right now. Even though now I'm back to spelling it all the time.
But I mean, I love the point that you're raising, because I think that it's easy to come out of this conversation thinking, oh, the people who go with tradition, they're just blindly following tradition, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Sometimes there's a strategic reason to align with tradition. So like what you described as a strategic reason, I've known people who have struggled with people mispronouncing their names their whole lives, and they want to switch their name to something that's easier to pronounce. And moreover, I've also known some women who have a terrible relationship with their biological father, and they can't wait to get rid of the surname that he gave them.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that too.
I certainly don't want to imply that if you go with tradition, you're just sort of following along and not thinking about it. Sometimes there are these strategic things out there that weigh on your decision, and it's actually an agentic choice. It does get tricky, and there is the inequity with divorce, right? And people knowing your business, and that doesn't seem fair to me that women have to experience that. But I think it's also important to recognize that you can align with tradition and still be empowered. It can still be an agentic choice.
Yeah. I'm curious what young people are doing now today. What is the trend? I really like that trend of making up your own name, making up a new name.
That would be another study. I'm getting ideas for my whole program of research now, but that would be another study to just say, hey, did you know that you can invent your own surname with your partner? You can blend the 2 together or come up with something different. What do you think about this? And see.
I actually can see the younger generations doing that.
Yeah.
Again, why not?
Why not? Yeah. I think, to be fair, I think that the surname tradition is still held quite strongly, but I also think that today's young people, like the people who are just coming out of high school, are very savvy about gender-related things than any other generation that's come before. I mean, there's like a widespread understanding of gender fluidity and what that means, more acceptance of people who identify as transgender. So, I do have some hope, so to speak, for this youngest generation that maybe they will be the ones to really push against the tradition.
Yeah, because you don't have to get married to change your name.
Yeah, that's true.
That's true.
You need to acknowledge that. To the extent that some people are using marriage as a strategic way to break free from their biological father, or the hassle of having to spell their last name, you can change your name if you want. You don't have to wait till you get married. If you really want to just change your name to Shaw or Cox or Smith, whatever, you can do that. And
so do you think if I changed my name to Michaela Goofball, it would be a good move?
Well, you are, but
that's what I was thinking. Call it what it is.
Or we could be like Cher and just have a first name, have one name.
Or Madonna. You're right.
Yeah.
Kanye.
You're right.
I just think we need to. I think it's healthy to have these discussions and to explore the options, and to recognize that there are options, that we aren't stuck, that we can make changes, and we don't have to wait for certain things to make those changes. It's about education. It's about getting the research like you're doing, Rachel, out there into the world, and letting people know what you're finding out, sharing your knowledge as widely as possible, because I think it's really important. So thank you for what you do. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to step outside of my usual sphere and actually talk with people. I think I said this is one of my favorite topics to discuss. And so I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to do so.
Yeah. And we'll tell Oprah.
Oh, good. Yeah. Get it on the phone, please.
Oprah, if you're there.
There's also, just real quick, I know we're out of time, but look at J.K. Rowling. See, she changed her name for her book because she wanted it to sound, there was something about she wanted it to sound so it didn't identify male or female.
Ah,
Yeah,
So she would sell more books.
Mhm.
Totally.
that's interesting.
And I thought, now that's interesting too. That could be a whole nother topic, but
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think well, Jennifer, on that note, do you think if she had been a man, she would have changed her name?
probably not.
Hmm.
So it was the female
She felt
sound,
she had to go with a name that didn't sound too female.
huh?
Yeah, I
Because
think
you can't-
people told her that boys wouldn't read her books if they were written by, I think her name was Joanna Kathleen. They wouldn't read a book by
yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So before we go, can I ask one more question? I'm just wondering, is there anything, I don't know, unique, wacky, or otherwise exciting to you that you're looking at right now?
Oh, so not within the naming arena. I'm sort of, I let my graduate students guide me at this point, and so I'm waiting for my next great graduate student to come in and give me new ideas. But I do actually like what we've talked about today, and at this like influencer social media culture and see whether surnaming preferences are different among folks who are playing that game. So, I mean, that could be a cool contemporary way to go.
Yeah.
I would love to hear about
Yeah.
Before you go, Rachel, could you please tell us, for those who want to read more of your work and learn more about you, what your contact info or website that they could visit to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, so you can look up my in one of two ways. You can either go to Google Scholar and just type my name into Google Scholar, and that'll give you a list of my papers. My website, I'm the Social Development Research Lab at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and that'll pull up what's going on in my lab, and then also some of these fantastic students who have helped me out with a lot of the work I've talked about today.
Great.
Awesome.
Oh, anyone else? Did we have any other questions, Michaela, that you could see?
Nope, not that I can see, but we'll certainly get them to you if I've missed them. It's been awesome learning all about what you're doing. What a fun job you have most of the time, I'm sure.
Pretty fun. I enjoy it. I get to study what I love every day. Can't ask for more.
Nope.
You lucky. Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to us and sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate it, Rachel.
Oh, it was my true pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You take
All right.
care.
Bye.
Bye.